Thank you. This is a wonderful night of celebration. We are delighted to have so many people with us tonight. On behalf of the Glessner House board and the staff, I would like to welcome everyone here. My name is Bill Tyre. I'm the curator and program director here at Glessner House. And I often think about the fact that the only reason I have a job is because of people like Ben and some of his cohorts who I'll talk about in a moment. So but anyway, it's a very special night. Last year, we launched our brand new annual preservation lecture series in honor of Wilbert Hasbrouck, who had passed away earlier that year. And Paul Lurie and his wife approached me shortly thereafter and said they wanted to do something to honor and perpetuate Will's memory. So we came up with the idea of an annual preservation lecture, which we launched last year. So when the idea came around for this year's topic, I happened to be in touch with Cynthia, and we were able to coordinate, after bouncing around quite a few dates, actually, I finally called her and I said, well, what if we actually did it on his birthday? Is that going to work? And she said, yes, that would be great. So it ended up being a perfect way to do that. But as you'll hear in the talk in a few minutes, but if you're not aware, I will just say that of course, Glessner House is here today because of the vision of a small group of individuals who realized the importance of the building in the mid-1960s when it was threatened with being lost. And so, key players in that decision to save the house and create what we have today would have been Ben and his brother Harry, Paul Lurie, Wayne Benjamin, Bill Hasbrouck, who I mentioned earlier. And we're delighted to have not just Ben, but Paul, Wayne, and with us. And it's wonderful when these people all come together that we can acknowledge them for the fact that we have a place to be together tonight. So tonight we are honored to have two individuals who will be speaking about Ben Weese and his career. The first speaker will be architect Peter Landon, who worked in Weese's office for 10 years. He is the founder and principal of Landon Bone Baker Architecture and is a champion of social consciousness and diversity in design, supporting neighborhood revitalization efforts in Chicago. And then immediately after Peter's introduction, our lecture for the evening will be given by Robert Bruegmann, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Art History, Architecture, and Urban Planning at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is the author of numerous books, including an upcoming volume on the architectural careers of Ben and his wife/partner, Cynthia. So we look forward to that. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to Peter for his remarks.
Thank you very much. I was asked to say a few words about Ben Weese to give you a sense or a reminder of who he is as a person. He has many personal and professional accolades for sure, but I will mostly leave that list to Bob, who will probably do a better job than I could anyway. I'm guessing that many, if not all of you, know Ben. He's a rare man, worldly for sure, yet one who stays close to home. His ideas have always been generous and almost always for the public good. And for the most part, everything Ben has done has been because he believes in it. He's an inspiration to all and a mentor to many. His work has been artful, intelligent, careful, and reflective, but never a pushover. And Ben has always been an exceptional person to work with. I was a young architect in 1976 in Chicago, and I had read a few things about Ben, mostly referencing his work at HWA, but I didn't know him. I went to the opening of 100 Years of Architecture in Chicago at the MCA, and then I walked over to the Richard Gray Gallery to see Chicago Architects, or Chicago Architects, or Chicago 7, whatever it is. I was struck by the work that Ben had in that show. His project was a courtyard with the main house and a few smaller outbuildings, all designed as sheds leaning up against a courtyard wall. As he described it in his brief, it was an idea that springs from the traditional pattern of living with a protective wall, a fragmentary structure that represents centuries of additive changes by successive inhabitants. The building was supposed to blend or disappear or become contextual. It did all of that, but the house was also simple in plan and modern in its clarity. Somehow the design spoke to me, as I imagine it did to many others, about the numerous possibilities there are in this world, yet how somehow they might be realized all at once. A design that wasn't exclusive in any way. It wasn't even about that at all. Rather, it was simply good design and presented there for anyone and everyone. I was also looking for a job at the time and was lucky enough to get an interview at Harry Weese and Associates. The interview was initially with Paul Hansen and then with Ben. After talking to Paul, he walked me over to the corner office of the inner circle at HWA. I was greeted with, "Hey, man." I didn't even know this guy. And right off the bat, he was completely familiar with me. He started probing around as to who I might be, and at the same time offered insights into people, buildings, the city, the world, etc. And I thought, wow, this seemingly casual and sort of funky guy who was talking as if he was part of, or at least aware of, the alternative scene, and at the same time was president of Harry Weese and Associates. How could he do all that? He was certainly had all the big-time credentials. He was one of the original alternative Chicago 7 architects, and he was quite active in the ongoing architectural dialogue. I'd spent a few years checking out the alternative world myself, but I wanted more, and Ben represented more to me, and he then offered me an opportunity to jump right in, which I did. My life kind of changed right on the spot. I worked at Harry Weese Associates for just about 6 months before Ben decided to move on and form Weese Seegers Hickey Weese. And then after another 6 months, I was asked if I wanted to join the WSHW team. I did. Before I left HWA, I asked Paul Hansen for his thoughts, and he said, if you were to stay here at HWA, you likely will work on buildings that will win design awards. But if you go with Ben, it's more likely that you'll be involved with buildings that are recognized for creative use of materials, energy efficiency, and social commitment, but the designs themselves will be considerably more modest. Paul knew Ben. He understood that he was not looking to wow anyone. Rather, he was looking at the tradition of simple and modest, but well-crafted buildings that speak to a time and history of their context and to the people who use them. His designs were not any less intentional, they were simply more modest. The office was always pretty small, maybe 10 or 12 people at the largest, and work-oriented. Not that there was no talking or joking around. It was an open office, to say the least. Every phone call, conversation, squeak, bart was heard by all. I sat next to Ben and listened to him talk to Cindy, his clients, friends, contractors and bankers. I heard every word Ben said and some of what Cindy said as they guided their 2 children through grade school and high school, doing their laundry, shopping for dinner, and cleaning the house. For me, it was all part of the humanity of the Weese experience. I want to say I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to work with both Ben and Cindy from the late 70s until the late 80s. This remembrance is about Ben, but it's important to mention that though he and Cindy had each had their own careers, they were partners and worked together in many ways. Architecture, civic engagement, land stewardship, land management, and of course the family. A very good couple, I'd say. The beauty of a small office is the office management part is simply a byproduct of the design process. You can't go out of business, of course, but other than that, the work was paramount. When you worked on a project with Ben, it took on the feeling of significance. He made me and others feel as if we were completely part of the design process with the goal of making the world a better place. Amongst other things, we looked at with respect to housing, were the English arts and crafts architects, Charles Voisey, Philip Webb, William Morris, workers' housing in London and Liverpool, and then Sullivan and Wright here in Chicago. We looked at plans and windows, the materials, the scale of the buildings, the relationship to the site and the landscaping. Historical models very much influence the work, not for nostalgic or sentimental reasons, but because they expressed an idea and they worked. It was a progressive and broad-minded view. Though he did get his hands dirty with design and tweaking plans and sketches of the buildings, he spent much of his time making sure the designs were not willful and arbitrary, like some of those whom he liked to critique were oft to do. Cindy was always more hands-on, while Ben tended to look carefully at the drawings, at the structure, materials, and detailing of each project. In the mid-'70s, most high-rise had become concrete frames with glass infill, but to Ben, a properly insulated and energy-efficient building was not a question. It was a given. You didn't do buildings that were not sustainable, even though we were not yet using that terminology. In the 70s, it was already known that energy was going to be an issue, but back then, and even today, design still often trumps environment. From time to time, Ben would invite Jack Hartray to come down from upstairs from Nagel Hartray to critique our details. It was a treat to have Jack come down and somehow combine his famous sense of humor with an extremely knowledgeable discussion of what might need work, along with real ideas on how to improve what we had. Ben was not shy or ego-driven. Rather, he was open and willing to engage in peer review in order to make the designs better. Ben was in touch with many people those days, as he always has been. He was a popular guy, full of ideas, and both he and Cindy were very much involved with the architectural community on all sorts of levels. There was regular back and forth with folks at the Art Institute, the AIA, CAF, now CAC, all sorts of architects, the Chicago Architectural Club, Chicago Women in Architecture, pretty much everyone and anyone interested in history, the city, modernism, teaching, ideas, buildings, etc. Though there's a lot of work in the office demanding our time, there was also this wonderful flow of people and ideas in and out of the office. Sometimes I or others would get invited in on what was happening, but if not, we would be flies on the wall, which is probably as interesting and a lot less work. It was really all good. There was a lot of time to talk in the car when driving out of town jobs. This was always insightful, but jobs close to home had their benefits as well. Often while Chestnut Place, Ben and Cindy's first husband and wife design, was being built, I'd walk over by their house in the morning and hitch a ride so we could stop off to take a look at the building as we drove into work. There wasn't much of a bar drinking scene culture at Weese. So from time to time, I would walk or drive home with Ben and Cindy, and if I was lucky, stay for a plate of stir-fried vegetables on their back porch on Hudson Street. While Cindy was the cook and the real vegetarian, Ben would say how he'd stand on the back porch of their house in Empire and toss seeds out in a fan-shaped, and the harvest would feed them for the winter. I guess that's how it works. One time I told Ben that Karen and I had made some bean soup that was most excellent, and it cost about 10 cents to make. And Ben said, yeah, well, we made some garlic soup that was really quite tasty, and it cost 7 cents. Tough competition, that guy. When I left the firm in 1987 to form my own firm with the goal of continuing to focus on affordable housing, it was kind of sad, but it was understood, and I was given tremendous support for what I, and eventually Jeff Bone and Catherine Baker, wanted to do. As I said, my life changed when I met Ben and Cindy. I recognized the true humanism in Ben's awareness of the world as a whole. He is a complex guy, but his social conscience is not complex. We do what we can, which is not everything, but what we do must be fair and equitable. That humanism transferred to our office, and I believe that everyone at Landon Moog Baker understands that we are part of a valuable lineage and how important it is that we continue with it and pass it on to the next generation. We'll do what we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. That was a wonderful tribute. I'm honored to be here to celebrate the life and work of a very remarkable man as well. And what I thought I would do this evening is because this was such a long and rich life and career, I thought I would do a quick run through chronologically of some of the important steps in it. Let's start here. This substantial Kenilworth house, the home of Harry Ernest Weese, a banker, and his wife, Marjorie Moore Weese, who was, and both of them had, besides the economic interest, had cultural interests as well. Into this substantial house come 4 children between 1915 and 1923, Harry, Jane, John, and Sue. And finally, in 1929, Benjamin Horace Weese. All 3 of the boys would eventually become architects. Ben was born when his father was already an older man, and his older brother Harry is already in his mid-teens. And because of this, in many ways, Harry becomes a surrogate father to Ben, encouraging to explore his artistic inclinations, particularly to develop his skill in drawing. Now, having an older brother as handsome, charismatic, and artistically gifted as Harry would be a source of pride for the younger brother, but also a real challenge for the rest of both of their lives. As a much quieter, more deliberate, and introspective character, Ben had to find his own way out from his brother's considerable shadow. In the early 1930s, in the wake of the Great Depression, the Weese family removed itself from Kenilworth to what was then the semi-rural town of Barrington. Ben takes naturally to farming, growing vegetables and raising goats and other animals. In 1933, Harry enrolls at MIT, still primarily a Beaux-Arts education, but Harry and his fellow students are very much aware of the avant-garde European modernism that was starting to break on the scene. Although Harry is now in Cambridge during the school years, during the summers he returns to Chicago and along with the entire extended Weese clan travels to Glen Lake, a beautiful site in northern Michigan where the family has land. Harry designs 3 cabins there. The first of these is for his own family, the one you see here. Ben, at age 7, helps his brother in constructing this with small jobs on the site. Ben witnesses the evolution of his brother's work after Harry gets back from a trip to Europe in 1937. And seeing that work, it makes him turn toward a new modernism inspired by the work he saw abroad, and particularly the more gentle and humane architectural modernism of Nordic architects like Alvar Aalto, who becomes an inspiration for the rest of his life. After school, Harry practices architecture briefly, but when he sees that war is about to break out, he joins the Navy. He serves on a ship in the Pacific during the war. Ben, meanwhile, very much absorbs from his family lessons about frugality, conservation, and self-sufficiency. As much as he is intrigued with his brother's career in architecture, he doesn't think it's for him. He writes a high school essay on why he doesn't want to become an architect. But tellingly, it has a cover illustration composed of images from Architectural Forum magazine. At the tail end of the war, his brother marries Kitty Baldwin, a vivacious young woman from Alabama. Out of the service and back in Chicago, Harry and Kitty, along with their friend Jody Kingery, open a store in Michigan Square building on Michigan Avenue. The idea is that the store can generate some income while Harry builds a practice. It's one of the first places in the country to offer modern furniture direct to consumers rather than only wholesale to the trade. Ben works for his brother. He's downstairs unpacking boxes of Aalto furniture and assembling them for sale. In 1947, it's Ben's turn to go to college. As an undergraduate at Harvard, he's still very unsure what he wants to do in his career. He's drawn to architecture, in part from exposure to his brother's work, but from the very beginning, he has this profound sense of ethical responsibility, and it makes him highly skeptical of architecture with its reliance on wealthy patrons and heavy focus on aesthetic matters. This only deepens with his contact with the Friends meeting in Cambridge with Quakers and Brethren. After receiving his BA in 1951, Ben decides to enter the graduate program in architecture. As was the case with Harry, Ben's education is interrupted by war, this time by the Korean War. Ben declares himself a conscientious objector. Now, I think it's hard for us today to realize what a radical step this was in the post-World War II era. when there was such an intense pressure to enlist in the armed forces. He is sent to Germany to work at a resettlement camp run by the Church of the Brethren. His experience in Germany is fundamental to his later career, both in terms of the empathy that he develops with people who are in need, but also his chance to see the churches and the vernacular buildings of northern Germany. He returns to America to work briefly in his brother's office and returns to Harvard, where he is heavily influenced by the Viennese architectural historian Edward Seckler, who stresses social ends of architecture. In 1956, he again interrupts the program in Harvard and follows generations of Americans to the Fontainebleau School of Sculpture, where he also sings in a chorus directed by the famous musician Nadia Boulanger. And he gets yet another chance to visit the architecture of Europe. The year 1957 turns out to be a momentous year in the life of the Weese family. In that year, when Ben returns from Chicago, he buys a 19th century house that had been converted into a boarding house in what was then a very sketchy neighborhood in Lincoln Park at 2133 Hudson Street, and remodels it into a residence for his mother upstairs and for himself in the basement. Also in 1957, Ben joins his brother's firm. This is a very lively and informal office, and it's growing quickly, too quickly by some accounts. Harry is charming, remarkably persuasive, graceful socially, with a good, quick sense of humor. Also a very fast and extremely talented designer. But he was never a very good businessman, and his style of running the office is often very chaotic. Although at least in the 50s and 60s, he keeps a very close watch on every project in the office, still he allowed Ben considerable leeway to develop his own projects. This was a very heady time. Chicago was in the midst of the great post-war economic boom. There is a new artistic scene in Chicago. In addition to architects that have practiced in the city for years, there is the arrival of European avant-garde figures like Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy at the Institute of Design. This galvanizes the architectural scene. Another big event in 1957 is Harry's winning a commission from the State Department for a building in what would become the new state of Ghana in Africa. It's a breakthrough moment for the new firm. Another commission that year arrives from Columbus, Indiana, from Irwin Miller, head of the Cummins Engine Company. Harry's work, together with that of Eero Saarinen, one of Harry's great mentors, convinces Irwin to create a program where his foundation would pay the commission of architects if the agencies in town would agree to hire a nationally recognized architect from a list that was drawn up by a blue ribbon panel. The result would soon become a kind of museum of modernism, and Harry's office did a great many of these buildings. And some of this work would be done by Ben, some of his earliest work. For example, this really little gem of a building in neighboring city of Hope, done for Irwin's bank. And most conspicuously, this school. Ben's projects tend to be more sober and simple than his brother's, often heavily influenced by vernacular buildings. Here he uses an interesting structure of reinforced bearing masonry, a kind of old tradition made new. Like many people in the office, his buildings differed in style from Harry's, but they all shared a common set of attitudes. By the early 1960s, all three brothers are launched in their architectural careers. Ben and Harry at Harry's firm, and brother John at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, a relatively new but very fast rising firm in Chicago. In spring of 1963, Ben is asked to teach a studio at Washington University in St. Louis. There he meets a young woman named Cynthia Rogers, who had grown up in Iowa. You can tell which one is Cindy without much problem. She's the only woman in the picture, a common condition in architectural schools in that era. By the end of the year, Ben and Cindy are married. Cindy moves into the house in Chicago and starts her own independent career. Ben continues to be busy at HWA. By the mid-1960s, Harry is at the height of his powers, is entering the most productive period. The office grows rapidly and needs space, takes over a loft building in the decaying neighborhood just north of the Loop. Harry and Ben were both what would be called urban pioneers. Harry's office is filled with youngsters from all over the world. Although Harry's office does a very wide range of projects of all kinds, Ben is mostly interested in housing and institutional work. For example, these row houses in Kenwood Gardens. A great deal of the work is in Iowa, particularly for small private colleges, where Ben tended to bond with the faculty and administration and would come back to these colleges again and again for new commissions. Among his buildings here in Chicago, there's the Latin School, which opens in 1969. And remember, this is amidst the turbulence of the anti-war, civil rights, and women's rights movements. But the building itself is quite serene and almost timeless. As I say, this stands in marked contrast to the events of the day, with these marches, the violence. Ben is politically to the left, but always politely militant. Cindy, although less vocal, shares many of his beliefs. Both Ben and Cindy become pillars of the architectural community. Here is Ben speaking at Glessner House. He and Harry were the prime movers in saving the building, and he becomes the first president of the Chicago School of Architecture Foundation, later the Chicago Architecture Foundation, Architecture Center, in 1966. Although Harry is the front man in the fight to save the Auditorium Theater, Ben plays an important behind-the-scenes role. Cindy, as one of the few female members in the profession, develops a strong interest in the role of women in architecture and is a co-founder of the group Chicago Women in Architecture. In addition to their work in architecture, Ben and Cindy become parents, first with Dan in 1965 and then Catherine the next year. The family continues the Weese tradition of traveling to northern Michigan in the summer. This tower is a project from one of those trips. They also travel every summer to Europe. In 1972, they buy an old storage shed in the small town of Empire, Michigan, that's not far from Glen Lakes. They convert this into a small, rustic, but very comfortable summer house. Back in Chicago, by the early 1970s, Ben is doing some of the largest projects in his brother's office. The Forest Park Community College in St. Louis was perhaps the largest. It's a tour de force of simple brickwork. The landscape is by that master of modern architecture and good friend of both Ben and Harry, Dan Kiley. Ben's buildings of the era continue in the tradition of the sober masonry work he had done earlier in his career. The Fine Arts Building at Drake University in Des Moines is a good example. One of the issues for Ben is always context. Taking, for example, in this case, such a large program and somehow putting it into, breaking the building up so it didn't overwhelm the neighborhood. He continues his interest in housing, for example, in an urban renewal area in Norfolk, Virginia. The years 1976-77 are another crucial turning point for Ben, Harry, and Cindy. Ben and Harry each design large-scale work that in some ways is perhaps the finest each would do while they were working together. For Ben, the work at this stage was the extraordinary Sawyer Library at Williams College, a masterpiece of careful adaptation to program and site. In it, Ben introduces multi-level study carrels that are almost small buildings in themselves, and which will show up repeatedly in future library works. And very sadly, this building has come down. For Harry, it's his undisputed masterpiece, the Washington Metro System. Architects tend to hate working with committees because it dilutes their vision, but in this case, having to go through multiple reviews with the clients and the Commission on Fine Arts perhaps saved Harry from the constant temptation to introduce new elements and ideas into his design. In any event, the result was spectacular, certainly one of the great monuments of American architecture. The years 1976-77 also mark a turning point in the career of Cindy. Her conversion of a corn crib in central Illinois is published in the magazines and wins awards. It really puts her on the map as a serious architect in her own right. Not surprising, with its sophisticated rusticity and impossibly photogenic imagery, it is hard to resist. However, at the very moment when all three architects have firmly established themselves, both their professional lives and the world of architecture were in the midst of profound change. In the world of architecture, Robert Venturi's book, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, had appeared in 1966. It seemed like, to many modernists, like a repudiation of everything they stood for. Instead of starting every project from ground zero and being pretty much concerned with program and structure, there were calls to be very concerned with urban context and with ornament and with the meaning of buildings. Harry reacts very strongly and negatively to Venturi's work, like this firehouse in Columbus, Indiana, with its seemingly arbitrary change of brick color and overscale lettering. He considers buildings like this frivolous and cartoonish and hates the ironic stance of the architects who soon became known as postmodernists. And this is actually very ironic because many of the things that the postmodernists were calling for in terms of history and in urban context were things that Harry himself had been very much interested in all his career. The turmoil created by the postmodernists is clearly visible in two Chicago exhibitions that were held simultaneously in 1976. On the one hand, there's the Canonical Modernism show. It focuses on minimal Miesian work, and it has work by Harry, but the work by Harry is mostly the kind that's closest to the work of Mies. And then there's the show of the Insurgents. Ben is a crucial figure in getting the ball rolling, along with Stanley Tigerman and Stuart Cohen. The exhibition includes the suave, classically inspired work by architects like Howard Van Doren Shaw, which were anathema to many of the modernists. Both Ben and Harry figured in this exhibition. Harry this time for a very different set of buildings. For example, the Baptist Church that you see here, a building that's clearly related to medieval architecture. And Harry's and Ben's work was included as well. For example, that housing tower in Norfolk, Virginia. Now, out of this ferment also comes an exhibition at the Richard Gray Gallery that Pete mentioned just a moment ago. It's called Seven Architects. They were the younger insurgents, led by Ben, but also that gadfly of Chicago architecture, Stanley Tigerman. Ben is one of the seven, although he would never jump wholly into the camp of postmodernists, and he largely avoided their ironic tone and confrontational stance. A couple of years later, this group would reconvene and call themselves the Chicago Seven, a clear reference to the Democratic Convention and the group that was causing problems at that convention. There were, of course, common elements. The group's interest in history meshes nicely with Ben's own, particularly Ben's interest in vernacular buildings. So, for example, his entry into the Chicago 7 exhibition was a house that was modeled on a traditional walled agricultural complex that Pete also was talking about, the kind of thing that could be seen throughout Northern Europe. Finally, still in 1977, in the midst of both personal triumphs by the Weese brothers, Ben notifies Harry that he wants to leave the office. As the office had become larger, Harry had become more unpredictable, sometimes careless with the firm's finances, and had started drinking more. And although it wasn't visible to the outside world, Ben felt that the work had started suffering. It was also increasingly clear that none of the younger people in the office were going to be made partners, and so Ben finally decided it was time to throw in the towel. So Ben opens his own office with Cindy and two former employees of Harry, Arnie Seegers and Thomas Hickey. The firm Weese, Seegers, Hickey. Weese was born at 230 East Ohio Street, and here you see it. By this time, both Ben and Cindy had established themselves in the architectural world, and an amicable split with his brother allowed Ben to bring some commissions to the new office. Over the years, the firm would undergo several changes in partnership, but the work remained remarkably consistent. It is currently Weese, Langley, Weese. While running their new practice, Ben and Cindy also continue their involvement with civic affairs and the architectural community, playing a role in key exhibitions, publications, and events. For example, the important exhibition, Chicago Women in Architecture, co-curated by Cindy at the Artemisia Gallery. The firm still does mostly residential and institutional work, including a number of tall residential buildings. This remodeled building at 1211 North LaSalle is conspicuous by the way Ben and Cindy commissioned trompe-l'oeil painting by artist Richard Haas to soften the appearances of three windowless facades. At Chestnut Place, Haas creates a spectacular decoration for the lobby based on the Church of San Miniato al Monte in Florence. Ben's work in colleges in Ohio and Iowa continues with a number of buildings. For example, this remodeling of a building by Walter Netsch of Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. Instead of adding a wing, which would probably have damaged the integrity of the original design, Ben pops up an addition above the roof and expands capacity with more of his ingenious study carols. A trio of churches designed by Ben in the 80s and 90s perhaps represents his finest achievement in the new office. These commissions allow him to push beyond the often very constraining programs of housing and educational buildings and to express some of his deeply felt sense of spirituality. The first of the three is the Evelyn Chapel at Bloomington, vaguely early American in form, although and is typical of the work of Ben, always with all of the elements radically simplified and abstracted. The great glory of these churches is the manipulation of light, particularly indirect lighting that bathes the chancel. For Ben, religion was a very personal, contemplative, and quiet affair, and his churches provide an appropriate setting for this kind of approach. The second is a church in Peoria for a congregation whose former home had burned. Here the form and historic precedents are largely drawn from medieval architecture and radically different from the chapel in Bloomington, but once again, all these elements are severely simplified and abstracted. And there is a similar sense of serenity and calm in the sanctuary. There follows the first addition to the Chicago City Day School in 1990, and I should say that these commissions by Ben are never entirely by Ben. The other people in the office, like Pete Landon or Cindy and the others, are very often or almost always involved. And there's a new set of rooms in the basement of the Art Institute, scaled for the use of children. Now, the year 1993 marks another watershed moment, as Cindy, after years of teaching in various schools of architecture and a great deal of work with the American Institute of Architects, is named Dean of the School of Architecture at Washington University in St. Louis. Then in 1994, Ben completes the third of his trio of churches, this chapel at Wartburg College, a Lutheran institution. In this, he draws inspiration from the Romanesque churches of Germany. It's perhaps the most complex of the three, and the one where Ben is most able to design all aspects of the building, from the building envelope down to the details of the liturgical furnishings. Of course, Ben is still playing a role in civic affairs. One of his pet peeves of this era was the rapid increase in the number of gas-guzzling SUVs. As reported by an amused reporter from the Tribune, Ben, a quote, white-haired, bespectacled gent who has bought only one new car in his life, a Volkswagen Beetle back in the 1960s, and quote, a first-rate architect, lifetime contrarian, and that great American archetype, the rumpled rebel, end of quote, would take these stickers, these Post-it notes, and plaster them on the windshields of SUVs as he took his morning walk around the neighborhood. Harry, in the meantime, is going through a long decline in his health and mental acuity. By the 1980s, he is not active day-to-day in his firm. In 1991, a group of employees buys Harry out. In 1998, Harry dies in a VA hospital in downstate Illinois. Now, after 2000, and particularly after Cindy returns from Wash U in 2005, Ben starts to taper down work at the firm, although he was still involved in the office. For example, this restoration and remodeling of Fullerton Auditorium and spaces for the Prints and Drawings Department at the Art Institute of Chicago. The same interest, lifelong interest, in not so much in orthodox historic preservation, but in conserving buildings and reusing them. He remains active in civic and architectural affairs, for example, on the board of the Graham Foundation and on the city's Landmark Commission, where he graciously stepped down after the former mayor, not so graciously, failed to reappoint him in 2011. Awards continued to roll in, and not just for Ben and Cindy, but also for former employees like Peter Landon. So I thought I'd end with this image of Ben and Cindy at Glessner House in 2016, where 50 years before, Ben had played a key role in saving the house and creating what became the Chicago Architecture Foundation. So, architect, civic leader, husband, father, grandfather, over 60 years of service and commitment to his family, his city, the architectural profession, and the larger world. Our hats are off to Benjamin Horace Weese at 90. Thank you.